Oh yeah, watch.
Beginning at 10:30 a.m. with both his defense and the prosecution teams present in court to continue legal arguments over his alleged use of social media to incite violence in southeastern Nigeria. Simon Ekpa's lawyer opened by arguing that the prosecution's evidence was selective and misrepresented Simon Ekpa's intentions, stating that his posts were misunderstood and not calls for violence. The prosecution countered forcefully, asserting that Simon Ekpa's online statements directly contributed to real-world violence and unrest, and insisted they would present specific evidence linking his words to harm done on the ground. Simon Ekpa's lawyer responded by emphasizing that the posts cited by the prosecution were out of context, that other people made similar posts, and that only Simon Ekpa was being unfairly targeted for blame. Simon Ekpa's second witness testified that Simon Ekpa was a peaceful, compassionate activist committed to non-violence and community engagement, denying that any of his posts incited violence. Simon Ekpa's second witness provided examples of Simon Ekpa's peaceful activism, including community cleanups and a peaceful protest in Finland focused on environmental issues, refuting claims that Simon Ekpa's actions were terrorist in nature. The prosecution cross-examined Simon Ekpa's second witness, suggesting that his close friendship with Simon Ekpa may bias his testimony and raising concerns about possible rehearsed answers between Simon Ekpa's second witness and Simon Ekpa's defense team. Simon Ekpa's second witness defended his credibility, stating that he based his statements on personal knowledge and consistent behavior he had witnessed from Simon Ekpa, reaffirming that Simon Ekpa's language was passionate but non-violent. A third witness, a European human rights lawyer and activist, was called by Simon Ekpa's defense team to explain freedom of speech and the difference between passionate expression and incitement to imminent violence. The third witness clarified that Simon Ekpa's posts, while possibly inflammatory to some, did not meet the legal standard of incitement because they lacked intent and a direct call for immediate lawless action, supporting the argument that Simon Ekpa's speech was protected under international human rights law. On the morning of Saturday, June 7, 2025, inside a courtroom tucked within the quiet but rigid corridors of the Finnish judicial system, a moment unfolded that was both shocking and revealing. Simon Ekpa, the Nigerian-born Finnish citizen whose name has become synonymous with digital activism and controversy surrounding the Biafran movement, stood at the center of a trial that had already drawn deep international attention. As the proceedings continued into their second week, something happened that pulled gasps from observers and immediately made headlines. In a moment of visible emotional eruption, Simon Ekpa tore apart legal documents, his eyes burning with fury, his hands shaking, and his breathing irregular, as if weighed down by months of pressure, scrutiny, and indignation. The courtroom, built for order and decorum, suddenly felt more like a theater of personal conviction than a neutral ground for justice. To truly understand what happened that morning and why Simon Ekpa reacted so dramatically, it is important to step back, observe the pattern of courtroom events, study the tone and rhythm of his trial, and look beyond the printed words of the news reports. What triggered such a public breakdown of composure in someone who has often presented himself as defiant but calm, passionate yet composed? And what does this outburst say about the man behind the headlines, about the legal process he is subjected to, and about the wider psychological and political implications of this courtroom drama? The trial resumed that Saturday at 10:30 in the morning under the shadow of several days of emotional testimony, legal wrangling, and public tension. Present in the courtroom were Simon Ekpa himself, his legal team, the Finnish prosecution, 3 security officers, 3 court interpreters, and a limited number of journalists. The judge presiding over the case had already made it clear that any disruption would not be tolerated. However, such warnings did not prevent the incident that unfolded when Simon Ekpa's defense lawyer stood to argue that the evidence the prosecution had built its case upon was not only selective but grossly misrepresented Simon Ekpa's intentions. The defense lawyer's voice was steady and polite, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of exasperation in his tone. He described how certain social media posts had been misinterpreted by investigators and prosecutors who, he argued, had cherry-picked words and stripped them from their original context. According to the defense, Simon Ekpa's statements were meant to call attention to injustices suffered by the Igbo people in southeastern Nigeria, not to call for acts of violence. The lawyer explained that any fiery rhetoric present in the posts was no different from what other political activists had expressed online, and yet, for reasons that appeared more political than legal, Simon Ekpa was being singled out and put on trial. What followed was a forceful response from the prosecution, whose lead attorney, a tall Finnish woman with sharp cheekbones and a rigid posture, stood and delivered a statement that seemed to pierce straight through the atmosphere of the courtroom. She accused Simon Ekpa of manipulating his followers with words crafted to provoke outrage, fear, and ultimately violence. Her voice did not tremble, and her gaze never left the judge as she described specific incidents of killings, arson, and unrest in southeastern Nigeria that she claimed were directly linked to Simon Ekpa's broadcasts and posts. The room remained silent for several seconds after she concluded, the weight of her words hanging in the air like dense fog. It was then that Simon Ekpa, who had sat through most of the hearing with a mixture of frustration and clenched jaw control, suddenly appeared to stiffen. The interpreter turned toward him to translate the last portion of the prosecution's statement, and in that moment, his expression changed. Those watching closely noticed the way his lips tightened and his shoulders rose. Something inside him had shifted. His lawyer stood to reply, trying once more to reframe the prosecution's evidence as manipulated and politically motivated. The argument included references to similar expressions of political dissatisfaction from other Nigerian activists who had not been prosecuted. The lawyer also emphasized the peaceful nature of Simon Ekpa's earlier activism, including environmental protests in Finland and community engagements that had nothing to do with violence or terrorism. At that moment, Simon Ekpa leaned forward and whispered something to his lawyer. The lawyer nodded but did not respond aloud. Within seconds, Simon Ekpa reached for a sheaf of papers on the desk in front of him. Observers initially thought he was preparing to read from the documents. Instead, he stood abruptly, looked directly at the judge, and, in a motion that appeared both theatrical and desperate, began tearing the papers in half one by one, each shred falling to the floor like a fragment of his breaking composure. Gasps filled the room. The court bailiffs moved cautiously, not rushing toward him but stepping forward just enough to remind him that they were present. The judge slammed her gavel once loudly and called for order. But Simon Ekpa was no longer in a place where calm words could reach him. His voice broke out with emotion, not shouting, but clear, filled with a pain that appeared raw and unfiltered. He asked why he was being treated like a criminal for speaking up about the suffering of his people. He said that the legal system had failed to understand not only his intent, but the desperation that had compelled him to speak in the first place. He accused the prosecution of using his words as political ammunition and not as evidence of actual wrongdoing. This moment was not just a personal outburst. It was a fracture in the procedural rhythm of the trial, a moment when the human being on trial ceased to be a defendant in the legal sense and became something else entirely. A symbol, a broken voice, a man pushed to a psychological edge. Simon Ekpa's behavior can be interpreted in many ways, depending on the lens through which it is viewed. For some, this was a deliberate performance, designed to draw attention and frame himself as a victim. For others, especially those familiar with the psychological toll of prolonged political persecution and the loneliness of exile, this was a genuine emotional explosion, a cry for recognition, and perhaps even a cry for help. Inside the court, the immediate aftermath was confusion. His lawyer gently pulled him back down into his seat. The judge called for a 15-minute recess. The prosecution sat still, their faces unreadable, while some journalists scribbled rapidly and others exchanged hushed commentary. What everyone agreed on was that something real had happened, something unplanned, and outside the script of a trial that had, until then, followed a rigid procedural path. After the break, Simon Ekpa returned to the courtroom. He looked more composed, though there was a visible strain in the way he held his body. He did not apologize for his actions, but he remained silent. His lawyer, in a subdued voice, addressed the court and asked for understanding, explaining that the pressure Simon Ekpa had been under had reached a boiling point. The lawyer added that Simon Ekpa's outburst, while regrettable, was a reflection of deep emotional distress and not a sign of contempt for the court. The court allowed the proceedings to continue. The next part of the session involved the testimony of Simon Ekpa's second witness, a longtime friend and colleague who painted a picture of Simon Ekpa that stood in sharp contrast to the prosecution's allegations. This witness described Simon Ekpa as a peaceful activist who had spent years engaging with local Finnish communities and who had always advocated for non-violent resistance. The witness spoke about community cleanup campaigns Simon Ekpa had organized in Helsinki, as well as his involvement in raising awareness about climate change through peaceful demonstrations. The witness appeared calm and confident, but during cross-examination, the prosecution sought to undermine his credibility by suggesting that the close friendship he shared with Simon Ekpa made his testimony inherently biased. The witness responded firmly, saying that while he was indeed a friend of Simon Ekpa, his statements were not based on loyalty, but on consistent behavior he had personally observed. He said that Simon Ekpa's language may have been passionate, but it had never been violent. He also denied that Simon Ekpa had ever encouraged anyone to take up arms or commit crimes, pointing instead to the way Simon Ekpa often ended his broadcasts with calls for peace and lawful resistance. This witness's testimony was then followed by that of a third person called by Simon Ekpa's legal team, a European human rights lawyer known for her expertise in international law and freedom of expression. She delivered what was perhaps the most intellectually weighty portion of the trial that day. She explained to the court the fine line between passionate speech and unlawful incitement. She acknowledged that Simon Ekpa's statements could be perceived as provocative, but she argued that under international human rights law, especially as interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights, speech must be both intentional and directly connected to a call for imminent lawless action to qualify as incitement. She said Simon Ekpa's posts lacked that critical link. They did not call for immediate attacks or violence, but rather expressed frustration, political critique, and support.
You know, Siam, and they have had. Yes.